Welcome to our second lecture on leadership in BMGT 364. As a refresher from our first lecture, we defined leadership as the process of influencing others to mobilize and facilitate individual and collective efforts towards the accomplishment of goals or objectives. We also reviewed the differences and similarities between leadership and management, discussed how the theory of management has shifted from trait theory to the theory that leadership is a combination of traits and skills, and we reviewed the Michigan and Ohio State studies on consideration, relations-oriented behavior, and initiating structure, task-oriented behavior. For the last concept, it's important to note that leadership studies by Blake and Mouton found that both of these attributes are important for successful leadership, a prescriptive and normative notion, whereas the Michigan and Ohio State studies were descriptive. For today's lecture, we will discuss the 4 dimensions of leadership, 2 of which are the consideration, relations-oriented, and structure, initiating, task-oriented dimensions we have already discussed. We will then discuss transformational and transactional leadership, discuss the 4 major characteristics of transformational leadership, review the situational and contingency models discussed in your textbook, and give an overview of the EVER simulation, which will happen next week. This image offers an overview of the 4 primary dimensions of leadership. This class will focus primarily on the transformational, transactional axis. Here are the definitions for the 2 types of leadership. Transformational leadership is a theory of leadership that focuses on how leaders can positively change or influences their followers, and how followers can do the same for a leader. Transactional leadership is a theory of leadership based on a system of rewards and punishment. Some assumptions of the transactional leadership are that people perform best when the chain of command is direct, detailed, precise, and clear, that people are motivated by rewards and punishment, and that obeying and complying with the instructions and direction of the leader is the primary goal of the followers, and that subordinates need to be carefully monitored to ensure that expectations are met. Again, those are the 4 primary tenets of transactional leadership. Bass's article titled From Transactional to Transformational Leadership, Learning to Share the Vision, further defines these 2 types of leadership. Transactional leaders guide their followers towards established goals with a framework of contingent rewards for performance and corrective actions for non-performance or deviation from standards. You can contrast that idea with transformational leaders, who create a vision and environment to motivate employees. Often this means moving employees beyond the current context into a new way of performing and thinking about their tasks. There are examples of inspirational leaders of organizations who have changed and innovated by employing a transformational style. One example is Carlos Ghosn at Nissan, who implemented cross-functional teams to help employees move beyond their immediate context and to help them think about larger issues facing the entire firm. Ghosn also engaged in new ways with customers to find out their new and changed desires when buying a new car, to set a new vision for the firm as a whole when designing cars. We will now watch a brief video clip of Steve Jobs discussing his style of leadership. As you watch the video, think about whether or not you would characterize Jobs' leadership style as transformational or transactional.
One of the keys to Apple is Apple's an incredibly collaborative company. And so, you know how many committees we have at Apple?
No.
0. We have no committees.
No committee.
We are organized like a startup. One person's in charge of iPhone OS software. One person's in charge of Mac hardware. One person's in charge of iPhone hardware engineering. Another person's in charge of worldwide marketing. Another person's in charge of operations. We're organized like a startup. We're the biggest startup on the planet. And we all meet for 3 hours once a week, and we talk about everything we're doing, the whole business. And there's tremendous teamwork at the top of the company, which filters down to tremendous teamwork throughout the company. And teamwork is dependent on trusting the other folks to come through with their part without watching them all the time, but trusting that they're going to come through with their parts. And that's what we do really well. And we're great at figuring out how to divide things up into great teams that we have and all work on the same thing, touch bases frequently, and bring it all together into a product. We do that really well. And so what I do all day is meet with teams of people and work on ideas and solve problems to make new products, to make new marketing programs, whatever it is.
And are people willing to tell you you're wrong?
Yeah.
I mean, other than snarky journalists. I mean, people that
Oh,
work
yeah. No, we have wonderful arguments.
And do you win them all? Or?
Oh, no, I wish I did. No, see, you can't. If you want to hire great people and have them stay working for you, you have to let them make a lot of decisions, and you have to be run by ideas, not hierarchy. The best ideas have to win.
So,
otherwise, good people don't stay.
But you must be more than a facilitator who runs meetings. You obviously contribute your own ideas.
I contribute ideas, sure. Well, why would I be there if I didn't?
So as you may have guessed, Jobs has a transformational leadership style. He eschews hierarchy and structure, focusing instead on ideas. Creating a culture of trust means that unlike a transactional leader, he does not have corrective actions for non-performance or rewards for meeting certain goals. Rather, he spends time facilitating discussion and engaging in debate around ideas. He also models the teamwork leadership style in his team that he'd like to see echoed throughout the organization. His focus on vision and not on the day-to-day operations of his employees make him a transformational leader rather than a transactional one. Now I want you to take 5 minutes to think about a time you experienced transformational leadership and a time you experienced transactional leadership. If you missed class on Wednesday, you can email me at nmcoomber@rhsmith.umd.edu with your thoughts for this class participation, for some class participation points. And I'll write my email address here. All right, hope you can read that. It's nmcoomber@rhsmith.umd.edu. And you can talk about number 2, which we discussed in project teams last time. There are 4 primary dimensions of transformational leadership: charisma, inspiration, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. We'll go through each one of these aspects individually. Charisma is the quality of leadership that most often gets attributed to the trait theory, because it's so difficult to teach. Charisma is the emotional component of leadership. The leaders shown here are deeply respected by their followers, and they energize followers with a compelling vision of their future and have a profound impact on their values and beliefs because of their own deeply held values and ethics. House's theory of charisma emphasizes that it's not only important to understand the qualities a leader possesses, but also to understand the impact that charismatic leaders have on their followers. The desire to influence others is an important aspect of a charismatic leader. Here in this slide, you can see some of the impact a charismatic leader has on his or her followers: trust in the leader's ideology, unquestioning acceptance, affection towards the leader, obedience, identification with the leader, meaning that you feel that you have some sort of relationship with them, and an increase in confidence. Inspiration is defined as the capacity of the leader to motivate followers to become committed to and invested in their vision. Inspirational leaders articulate a strong vision, making communication an important aspect of transformational leadership. An inspirational leader shows passion and optimism, empowers others to act, and motivates others to engage in extra effort. We'll discuss motivation further in our lectures following the Everest simulation. One important aspect of inspirational leadership is the ability to craft a message. We'll watch a short video of Steve Jobs' commencement address at Stanford, actually a short portion of the video. Listen for how he engages his audience, for any repetition or rhythm in his speech, and for any metaphors that he uses.
Thank you. I'm honored to be with you today for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Truth be told,
I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why'd I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.
So I'll talk a little bit about some of the framing and rhetorical crafting that Jobs uses in the speech. First, I'd like to point out that Jobs compliments his audience to start his speech, helping them connect and identify with him. This is a really important technique that a lot of leaders use. So this helps his audience connect with him even though, as he states, he's a college dropout and this is the closest he's been to a college graduation. He also emphasizes the importance of college, therefore validating their experience of graduating college through his story about the wishes of his biological mother. Jobs also uses repetition, dropping out, dropping in. He makes this concept interesting and central to this part of his speech. He takes a typically negative concept of dropping out and makes it positive into dropping in. Last, I'd just like to point out the metaphor that Steve Jobs uses at the end of this particular portion of his speech to discuss his journey in life, connecting the dots. He makes a point that you cannot connect the dots looking forward, only looking backwards. And finally, I'd just like to make a comment that he does use a lot of humor in this speech as well, which makes him identify with his audience. It's an important technique that many leaders use when they're speaking to make them more relatable and personal. I want you to think about, as you move forward with your day after this lecture, think about any experiences or opportunities that you might do today to set you on a path to success. Sometimes they might be outside the box, such as the calligraphy class that was so central to Steve Jobs' creation of the Mac. I encourage you to watch the rest of the speech on your own. Transformational leaders also stimulate their employees intellectually, besides in just an emotional context, the way the past point talked about. They help their followers rethink assumptions and innovate. Technology and Apple serve as another example of this type of leadership. A leader creates a platform and upon which his employees can innovate. And from technology, a platform is a piece of technology that allows others to build on top of it. An example of this would be the Apple iPhone. By opening up their technology to developers, even sometimes outside Apple, to create apps on top of the iPhone, including some that we can't live out, like Spotify, Waze, Angry Birds, Apple has made the iPhone an indispensable piece of technology. Leaders essentially do the same thing for the employees. They create a platform which enable their ideas. The leader themselves must have enough ideas and intellectual power to create something, but also allow enough to trust to have others innovate on top of it. The last dimension of transformational leadership, individualized consideration, is similar to the consideration relations-oriented dimension of leadership that we discussed last time. By getting to know the unique skills, talents, and attributes of their employees and trusting them with their work, a leader allows employees to develop their potential more fully. In one of my favorite articles by Rosabeth Moss-Counter entitled Power Failure in Management Circuits, the most powerful leaders are those who share power. By allowing others to create and own ideas within a company, the leader creates a company that can be more innovative. Fostering and caring for the people in an organization is one way a leader can share power. This is a brief visual of the differences between transactional and transformational leadership. In summary, essential sort of point that we're going to boil this down to is that transactional leaders lead to meet expectations, whereas transformational leaders lead to exceed them. Just want to point out to you with this slide that we'll be undergoing a 360-degree feedback, which will allow for you to assess your own unique leadership qualities, and that will help in the next aspect of our lecture when we talk about situational and contingency models of leadership, know kind of your starting point for leadership, where you're beginning from. So we've discussed transactional and transformational leaders. Which do you think is better? As we move on to discuss situational leadership and contingency theory, that we'll discover that while transformational leaders may be the type of leadership that's missing from our American workplace, there are times when each type of leadership is important and is required. The two perspectives that will help us uncover which of the four dimensions of leadership is most appropriate, depending on the situation, are Ken Blanchard's situational leadership theory and Fiedler's contingency theory. I'll discuss each one of these in more detail. Situational leadership theory encourages leaders to develop awareness and adaptability. Awareness of their leadership context will help them to understand which of the four dimensions of leadership they will need to employ. Understanding your own leadership style through 360-degree assessment, such as the one we're going to do in class, will help you understand your starting point so that you can know when you may need to go outside of your leadership comfort zone because of the situation. The situational leadership theory demands that leaders match their style to the setting and the competence and commitment of their subordinates. Whether a leader is more directive or more supportive, he or she must determine the situation and competence of the subordinates and either adapt his or her style, so change his or her style to match the style of the subordinates, match his or her style to what the subordinates need, or use power and influence to change the behavior of subordinates. This is the basic tenet of situational leadership theory. Contingency theory is similarly adaptive, where the leader must adapt his or her style, but includes more complexity, and we'll go into deeper detail on this in the next few slides. So contingency theory promotes the idea that there is no one best way to structure an organization. It's in opposition to the Taylorian theories of scientific management, which we briefly discussed in the beginning of our semester together. Basic leadership styles are task and relationship motivated, and which direction that they move towards is based on the situation and the leader-member relations. So the situation and also how good or bad a relationship a leader has with his subordinates. How much confidence the members of the team place in the leader, their loyalty towards him, and their attraction towards him. Which direction the leader must take also depends on how clearly the tasks are structured. Are they unstructured or are they more structured? These two factors, leader-member relations and the clarity of the structure of tasks, determine how much power, control, and influence a leader must exercise. Fiedler's model, which we'll find a graphic of on the next slide, is based on 3 dimensions: whether or not leader-member relations are good or bad, whether or not his task is structured or unstructured, and how much positional power a leader has within his or her organization. This power being positional means sort of where the leader falls on the organizational chart. How much leader the organization says that he has, how much power the organization says that he has. So here we have Fiedler's model. You can use this model to determine whether or not you should be more structure initiating or task oriented, or more consideration and relationship oriented. Using Steve Jobs as an example, we will assume that his relationship with his subordinates is good, so starting at the top with leader-member relations. Let me find my pointer. So we'll assume that Steve Jobs has a good relationship with his subordinates. We'll assume that his task structure is relatively unstructured due to the startup and freewheeling nature of Apple, as he described in our first video. He has high position power. He's a CEO. So he would get a score of 3, and he would need to be more task-oriented in his work. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, if we say that a leader has poor leader-member relations, structured tasks, and high position power, we'd see that he or she would get a score of 5 and that he or she would need to be more relations-oriented. Because of his power and poor relations with his staff, if the leader is too task-oriented, his or her team might be really unfavorable towards him and rebel. Focusing on relations will help the leader-member relations develop and then allow him to move into a category where he or she is more task-oriented. So if leader-member relations are poor, tasks are structured, and position power is high, we're going to be relationship-oriented, which hopefully will allow the leader to move into this category where tasks are structured, power is high, and he can become more task-motivated. In general, when situations are extremely favorable on this end of the spectrum, extremely unfavorable on this end of the spectrum, or moderately favorable right here, the task-oriented style is going to work better. When situations are moderately unfavorable here, or only leader-member relationship is unfavorable, relations-oriented style is going to work best. Fiedler's contingency model states that leader effectiveness depends on his or her personal style and the degree to which a situation gives him or her power, control, and influence over a situation. The 3 questions that you can ask to use this model are seen here and correspond to the situational considerations on slide 20. So are leader-member relations good or poor? Is this task structure structured or unstructured? And is the leader's position power strong or weak? That brings us to the summary for the lecture today, and I will go over on the next couple of slides our Everest simulation. So we discussed the 4 dimensions of leadership, talked about transformational versus transactional leadership, discussed the 4 characteristics of transformational leaders, and then we discussed situational and contingency model. I encourage you to review the syllabus for upcoming deliverables and due dates on your team project. Your first deliverable for the team project is due next Wednesday. You also should have purchased the Everest simulation, and you need to check Blackboard for the location of the computer lab for your team. It's under course documents. So for the Mount Everest simulation, the basic goal that your team will be trying to reach is to reach the summit. You're going to have different weather conditions, supplies, and individual goals, and also hiking speed that's going to affect the overall team's progress and performance. Each member has a unique role to play in assisting the team: leader, photographer, environmentalist, marathoner, physician, and oxygen observer. You're going to have to determine how to distribute effectively the supplies and the oxygen, and you're going to have 70 minutes maximum to run through 6 rounds of the simulation. The simulation, like I said, will proceed in 6 rounds. Some rounds will require more time than others, so you have to kind of be efficient whenever you can and move on to the next round. The person in the role of leader will advance the simulation for the next round, and the idea is that you'll have gotten to the third round, end of the third round at the 35-minute mark, so that's halfway through class. The team's score depends on the extent to which you fulfill the team goals. And the first session that we'll be doing on Monday is going to be a practice session. It's on Wednesday that we'll be doing the session that will be scored. You'll complete a midpoint and end of simulation surveys, and mistakes can be costly. If any of the members have to return to base camp during the simulation, they can still aid their teams and should continue to participate in the decision making. That's it for the lecture for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in class next week.